I pretended to be unconscious in my hospital bed for 4 days and listened to my own mother and brother plan to pull my life support and collect my insurance money while I was still breathing. The fluorescent light above my bed buzzed at a frequency I came to know the way you know a voice, a low, persistent, institutional hum, the kind of sound that was designed to fill silence without filling it, not music, not quite noise, something in between, an announcement that you were in a place where things happened that required constant, indifferent illumination. I had been listening to it for 3 days before I understood that the silence it was filling was the silence of my own family deciding I was worth more dead than alive. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision would be a kindness to people who deserve none. I was not in a medically induced coma. I was not sedated past consciousness. I was not lingering in the gray zone of head injury, present but unreachable, the way people imagine coma patients to be, suspended in a dark water between worlds, dimly aware, gradually surfacing. By the morning of day 3 following my accident, I was fully awake, fully alert, capable of moving, speaking, pressing the call button, demanding water, asking questions, doing any of the 100 small ordinary things a living person does in a hospital bed to assert that they are still, in fact, alive. I chose to do none of those things, because lying still and silent in that bed, with my eyes closed and my breathing slow and even, was the single most useful thing I could do with my consciousness at that moment. It was possibly the most useful thing I had ever done in my life. My name is Mara Calloway. I was 25 years old the morning I hit black ice on Route 9 outside of Hardin, Vermont, coming home from a night shift at the Ridgecrest Emergency Medical Station. I was a paramedic, had been for 2 years, after a certification process that had taken me longer than most because I had started it twice, once at 21, which I'd abandoned when everything collapsed around the trial, and again at 23, when I had rebuilt enough of myself to finish it. I rode a 2019 Honda CB500F to work because Vermont in October has maybe 6 good weeks for riding, and I intended to use all of them. The leaves were peak color the week of my accident. I remember this because I had been thinking on the drive home that I should take the longer route back through Northfield just to see the ridgeline. I didn't take the longer route. I took Route 9 because I was tired. The bike went out from under me at 42 miles per hour on a curve I had ridden perhaps 300 times without incident. I hit the guardrail. I hit the asphalt. I hit the guardrail again. I remember the sequence very clearly. The loss of traction, the moment of weightlessness, the sound my helmet made against the ground, which was less dramatic than movies suggest, and more like a wet crack, like a knuckle popping inside a sock, then nothing. I woke up in Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center's trauma wing 21 hours later. 2 cracked ribs on the left side, the second and third. A compound fracture of the left tibia that would require surgery within the week, according to the orthopedic consult. A grade 2 concussion that had produced a 21-hour blackout, which, the hospitalist explained, was within the range expected for an impact of that severity. A laceration above my right ear that required 11 stitches, and had, according to the nurse who changed my dressing, bled in a way that looked considerably worse than it was. She said this with the cheerful detachment of someone used to managing other people's terror, and I found it deeply reassuring. Her name was Brienne. She had dark hair and efficient hands, and the particular quality of someone who had absorbed a great deal of human suffering and chosen as a response to it to become more competent rather than harder. I liked her immediately. I have liked her ever since. Brienne told me I was lucky. She said it in the particular way medical professionals say things that are both true and inadequate, not as comfort exactly, but as orientation, a coordinate to help you locate yourself on the map of possible outcomes. No spinal damage, no internal bleeding, no brain bleed. The concussion was real but not progressing. In another 4 or 5 days, she estimated, I could begin weight-bearing on the leg with a walking boot. In another 2 weeks, I could go home. She said the word home with the confident warmth of someone who assumed it was a good word for me. She couldn't have known how complicated it was. I didn't correct her. I thanked her and I slept. On the morning of day 2, I felt nearly normal, which is to say I felt like myself with an overlay of pain and institutional tedium. The headache from the concussion had downgraded from a thunderclap to a sustained pressure behind my eyes, unpleasant but manageable. The ribs ached only when I breathed too deeply, which I was doing deliberately to test them. The leg was in a temporary splint, heavy and numb with pain medication, but I could feel my toes when I wiggled them, and that felt like a victory. I ate breakfast, scrambled eggs and dry toast and a container of orange juice from a small plastic cup. I answered questions from the hospitalist on rounds, a young woman named Dr. Park, who moved through her morning at the pace of someone running slightly late for everything. I asked about my discharge timeline. I was pleasant and cooperative and completely engaged with the bureaucratic process of getting myself out of that building and back to my apartment and back to my life. Then my brother Elliot called the nurse's station. He called the station, not my cell phone. I noticed that. He didn't have my cell number because I had changed it 6 months earlier and not told him. I'd changed it after finding something at my father's house that I'll explain in a moment, something that had clarified for me, with a precision I hadn't wanted, exactly what level of access it was appropriate to give my brother. He knew where I was because he had a Google alert set for my name, which I had discovered only the previous April when I was at my father's house, and saw it reflected in a browser window Elliot had left open on the kitchen counter. I had asked him about it then, keeping my voice light and neutral, and he had said it was just something he did provided for all family members, a habit he kept in case of emergencies. He said it so easily, so naturally. The way people say things they've prepared for being asked. The nurse at the station told him I was resting and she'd pass on his regards. She came by my room to let me know my brother had called. I thanked her. I did not ask her to transfer the call. I said I was tired and I let my eyes drift closed, and I stayed that way for a long time after she left, looking at the inside of my eyelids and thinking about the last time I had heard my brother's voice from a room where he didn't know I was listening. That memory is where this story truly begins, not the accident. The accident was just the mechanism. The story begins years before that, in a house on Aldermore Road in Wentworth, Vermont, and it runs through a courtroom and a Christmas dinner and a hospital hallway, and ends for now in a city I won't name where I live under a name I won't use here. But before I can tell you how it ended, I need to tell you what it was made of. I grew up in Wentworth, Vermont, population 4,000, in a house my parents bought in 1991 for $62,000, and that was worth, by the time I was a teenager, nearly $300,000. My father, Desmond Calloway, sold heavy equipment, excavators, bulldozers, the massive machines that rearrange terrain for construction and mining operations, and did well enough at it that we had a pool table in the basement and a ski pass for the Sugarbush Valley every winter, and went to a beach in Florida every March. My mother, Kathleen, taught 3rd grade at Wentworth Elementary until I was 12, and then she stopped teaching, and we never talked about why she stopped, which told me everything I needed to know about it. My parents were not unhappy exactly. They were the specific kind of not unhappy that results from two people who have built an arrangement that works and decided the arrangement is love. They didn't fight. They didn't display great warmth either. They existed in a domestic equilibrium that was stable and functional and about as emotionally intimate as a well-run office. My father was respected in Wentworth. My mother was well-liked. They had friends. They had a routine. They had a social position that they tended carefully, the way you tend a garden. Not because you love the garden exactly, but because the neighbors can see it from the road and you understand that it reflects on you. Elliot is 3 years older than me. He was a social child, then a social teenager, then a young man whose social nature had gradually revealed itself as something more like strategy. He went to the University of Vermont for 2 years, studying business, and dropped out after his second year citing vague professional ambitions that no one pressed him to define. He spent a year in Portland, Maine, doing something he described as independent consulting, and that I later understood to mean making cold calls for a residential solar panel installation company. Then he came home to Wentworth at 23 and simply began inserting himself into the financial architecture of our parents' life. This was a role he gave himself. No one assigned it to him. He returned home one fall and began sitting in on my parents' conversations about money and investments and the business, and they let him, and then they began consulting him, and then they began depending on him, and by the time I was 22 and he was 25, he had power of attorney over my father's business accounts and a seat on the board of the Wentworth Savings and Loan that my father had facilitated. He had a leased BMW and an apartment in Burlington, and he described himself, at dinner parties, as a family estate coordinator, which was not a real job title, but was not entirely wrong either. I want to be careful here. I don't want to write my brother as a cartoon villain, a person who was purely and simply evil from the beginning, who existed only as a dark force in my life. That would be dishonest, and it would also be wrong, in the particular way that simple stories about complicated people are always wrong. Elliot and I had been children together. We had shared a house and meals, and the particular texture of growing up in the same family, with the same parents, in the same small Vermont town. We had not been close, but we had not been enemies. We had the ordinary sibling distance of two people with different natures who happened to share a bloodline. He moved through the world with a charm and sociability I had never possessed, and I moved through it with a seriousness and independence he had never respected, and we had largely let each other alone. What I had always understood about Elliot, even as a child, was that his warmth was directional. It moved toward people who were useful to him and away from people who weren't, with the clean efficiency of a compass finding north. He could be generous, funny, deeply attentive when it served him. When it didn't, the warmth thinned like ice in March, and there was nothing beneath it but calculation. I had recognized this when I was about 17, and I had filed it away and kept my appropriate distance, and for several years that was enough. What changed everything, and when I say everything I mean the fundamental architecture of my understanding of my entire family, the load-bearing beliefs about who these people were and what they were capable of, was my Uncle Walter. Walter Pruitt was my mother's older brother. He was 54 years old at the time of his arrest. He was a landscaper who did work for half the residential properties in Wentworth and the surrounding 3 towns. He was the kind of man who was everywhere. At the 4th of July parade, at the school fundraiser, at the church harvest supper, at Little League, at the volunteer fire department meetings, at the winter carnival and the Maple Festival and the town meeting. He was the kind of man who, when you described him to someone from away, sounded almost like a cliche of small-town belonging. He was the kind of man nobody could imagine doing anything wrong because he was too visible, too present, too completely and deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary life to be hiding anything significant. His picture had been in the Wentworth Courier 4 times in 3 years for various acts of modest local heroism. He had pulled a car from a ditch one February. He had organized the cleanup after the flood of 2013. He had started a fundraiser for a family who lost their house. He began abusing me when when I was 7 years old. He stopped when I was 18 and left for college, which I had chosen specifically because it was far enough away that he couldn't reach me and close enough that my parents couldn't claim I'd abandoned them. He never once spoke to me directly about what he was doing. He simply acted as though it was something that happened between us the way weather happens, impersonal, predictable, not requiring commentary or acknowledgement or apology. He existed in my childhood as a presence I learned to arrange my life around, to anticipate, to avoid when possible, to endure when avoidance wasn't possible. I became very good, very young, at reading rooms and managing exits and making myself small in ways that grown-ups interpreted as shyness. It was not shyness. It was survival adapted to a specific threat. I want to say something about this that I don't say easily because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. The reason I stayed silent for 15 years was not fear of Walter. It was fear of my family. It was the specific, earned knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect me had a greater investment in not knowing than I had capacity to overcome. I had tested this, obliquely, the way children test load-bearing walls, carefully, not wanting to bring the whole thing down, and the results had been consistent. My mother, when I had tried once at age 11 to suggest that Uncle Walter made me uncomfortable, had said, "He's always been a little awkward. You just have to be patient with him." My father, when I had once at age 14 tried to say that I didn't want to be left alone with Walter at family events, had said, "Walter's a good man. You're too old for that kind of nonsense." I had understood. I had stopped testing. So I carried it. I carried it through high school and through my first year of college at the University of Vermont, where I studied public health and thought, in a vague and slowly clarifying way, about medicine. I carried it with me in a compartment that I maintained with a discipline that looked, from the outside, like composure. I was a good student. I had friends. I ran in the mornings and worked at a coffee shop on weekends and had the mostly ordinary life of someone who had learned to partition her pain with extraordinary efficiency. I did not think about what I was carrying most of the time, and then something happened that changed the calculus completely. My cousin Petra was Walter's niece from his second wife's family, 11 years old, the daughter of his wife's sister, who had spent 2 summers in Wentworth staying with the Pruitts when her parents were going through their divorce. She told her school counselor something in the fall of my 22nd year. I don't know the exact words she used. I know only what the result was: a report to the Wentworth Police Department, an investigation, and an arrest. When I found out about Petra, I called my mother. I will skip over most of this conversation because it has already cost me enough. What I will tell you is that I drove to Wentworth the following week and sat in the kitchen of the house on Aldermore Road with both of my parents, and I told them everything. I told them carefully, specifically, chronologically. I had rehearsed it, if rehearsal is the right word for the years of processing that go into the act of saying something you've kept silent for a decade and a half. I told them the ages, the locations, the incidents. I told them what it had done to me, and what it had cost me, and what it meant that they had not seen it. My mother, who had been listening with a stillness that I had read as receptivity, but which I later understood as shock, set down the gravy boat she'd been holding, white ceramic, blue rim, a piece from her grandmother's set, and looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know, Walter's been going through a very difficult divorce." I stared at her. I waited for her to continue. She did not continue. The divorce was the thing. The divorce was what she had offered in response to 15 years. My father said I was misremembering. He said this in the careful, measured tone he used for everything, the same tone he used to close equipment deals and attend parent-teacher conferences and decline invitations to events he found inconvenient. He said children sometimes constructed narratives around innocent incidents. He said the word constructed with academic precision, as though the entire experience I was describing was a kind of deliberate architecture I had assembled from raw materials that were, in themselves, innocent. He said I should talk to someone. I said I was talking to someone. I was talking to them. He said he meant a professional. Elliot was not in the room for this conversation. He came in partway through, having returned from wherever he'd been that afternoon, and he stood in the doorway, and he absorbed what was happening, and he said, "You've always been dramatic," and walked through to the kitchen to get a beer. That was November. I drove back to Burlington that night, and I did not speak to any of them for 4 months. Then Petra's report produced its legal results, and I was contacted by the Wentworth County District Attorney's Office. I cooperated. I gave a statement. I became, in the legal terminology, a corroborating witness with independent and prior knowledge. The trial happened 14 months after the arrest. It was, in its way, its own particular ordeal, not because of the legal process, which moved with the slow institutional dignity of a legal process, but because of the daily reality of walking into a courtroom and sitting in a witness box and looking at your uncle and looking at your family in the gallery and telling the truth in a room where half the people present needed the truth not to be true. I testified for 4 days, not 5 minutes, 4 days. Walter's defense attorney tried several approaches in sequence, that Petra and I had coordinated our accounts, which the phone records disproved, that I had coached Petra, which was impossible given that I had not been in contact with her, that I had a documented history of psychological instability, which his documentation of consisted of a single emergency room visit at age 19 for a panic attack that had no established clinical connection to anything he was implying. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and came back with a guilty verdict on 6 counts. My father walked out of the courtroom before the sentence was handed down. He walked out in the middle of the sentencing phase, through the double doors at the back of the gallery with without making eye contact with anyone. My mother stayed, held in place by Aunt Vera, Walter's wife, who had remained his wife throughout all of this, who sat in the gallery each day performing a grief and loyalty that occupied the full range of her emotional vocabulary, who gripped my mother's arm and would not release it. My mother did not look at me once during the sentence, not once in the 2 days I testified, not once during the verdict, not once as Walter was sentenced to 8 to 12 years in the Vermont correctional system. Elliot had not attended the trial. He had not attended a single day. When I called him that evening from my car in the parking lot of the Holiday Inn in Montpelier, where I had been staying during the proceedings, he said, "I hope you're satisfied." Then he hung up. I was not satisfied. Satisfaction would have required that something had been restored, that the verdict had returned something to me that the preceding years had taken. It had not. What it had done was confirm the record. It had established, in the most formal and irrefutable way available to human civilization, that the thing I had said happened had happened. I had that. I had the confirmation. And I had the understanding, which settled into me slowly over the weeks after the trial, that my family's failure to protect me had not been an accident or an oversight. It had been a choice. They had chosen Walter over me because Walter was a man, and Walter was beloved, and Walter was load-bearing in the family's sense of itself, and I was a girl who was creating a problem that didn't need to exist. That understanding, the one where I stopped explaining my family's behavior as weakness or confusion or love that expressed itself wrongly, and started understanding it as a consistent pattern of choosing their own comfort over my safety, is the understanding that made the next years possible. It is the understanding that let me mourn what I'd lost without being destroyed by it. And it is the understanding that, when I was lying in that hospital bed 3 years later and heard my brother talking about the mechanics of collecting my death benefit, placed what I was hearing in its correct context immediately, without denial, without the nauseating surprise that comes when something terrible is also completely unexpected. It was not unexpected. I had been building the record for years. After the trial, I rebuilt my life with the deliberate, methodical approach of someone who has learned, through hard experience, that the ordinary rewards of ordinary effort are not nothing. I restarted my paramedic certification. I worked through the program at Central Vermont Medical Center's EMS training division over 18 months, completing my clinical hours at the Barre City Ambulance Service, which operated in an area with enough call volume to give trainees real exposure. I was good at the work. I had the particular temperament that emergency medicine rewards. I was calm under pressure, specific in my observations, capable of doing what needed doing without requiring the moment to mean more than it did. My preceptor, a 20-year EMS veteran named Derek who believed in the pedagogical technique of telling you exactly what you'd done wrong immediately after you did it, told me I had the best hands he'd trained in 3 years. I got the position at Ridgecrest EMS in Hardin at 23. I found the apartment, a 1-bedroom on Ridgecrest Road, $1,200 a month, 3rd floor walk-up with a window that faced east, and received enough morning light to make the space feel larger than it was. I rode my motorcycle on the good days. I went to therapy on the Thursdays I wasn't working. I read. I cooked reasonably. I had a small circle of friends from the EMS station, and a somewhat larger circle of acquaintances from the coffee shop in Hardin where I spent my days off. I was, slowly and imperfectly, constructing something that deserved the name of a life. I maintained limited contact with my family, selective, managed, kept within defined parameters that I had set for myself after a long conversation with Dr. Felicia Osei, my therapist, about what was healthy versus what was habitual. I went to my grandmother Nana Ruth's birthday each year because she was 80 years old, and I loved her in the uncomplicated way that was possible only with her. She had never once failed me, had never performed anything, had never looked at me with the particular flicker of inconvenience that I recognized in everyone else's eyes when I spoke the truth about my life. I attended the family Christmas dinner in December of my 24th year because she asked me directly, which she rarely did, which meant she felt it mattered. So I went. That was the night I heard the conversation that I thought about every day for the next 10 months, the one that I was still thinking about when my brother called the nurses station on day 2 of my hospitalization. I had arrived at my parents' house on Aldermore Road at 4 in the afternoon. Christmas dinner was at 6. I stayed through dinner, made it through the particular forced pleasantness of the occasion. My mother asking careful questions about my work, my father talking to Elliot about business matters with the absorption of 2 people conducting a private meeting at a public event. And then around 8, I said I was leaving. I had an early shift. I gathered my coat from the upstairs closet. I said goodbye to Nana Ruth, who was in the sitting room watching something British on television, and I went out the front door. I got to my bike, and I reached into my jacket pocket for my gloves, and I didn't have them. They were in the upstairs closet where I'd gotten my coat. Standard issue motorcycle gloves. Mid-weight. Not worth leaving. I went back in through the kitchen door because the front door locked behind you, and I didn't want to ring the bell and announce myself. The dining room was to the left of the kitchen. The door was partially open. I heard Elliot's voice, quiet, careful, the voice he used when he was conducting rather than performing, and I stopped in the hallway, and I listened. The life insurance policy Dad set up when we were kids, $200,000 plus the accidental death rider. If she died without a will and without other dependents, which she doesn't have, she lives alone, it flows to the estate. I checked. My father's voice. Elliot, I'm telling you what I found. There's also the EMS carrier. If she's killed while in transit to or from a shift on her bike, which she rides, Besides, the county carrier pays out an additional $50,000 to $80,000. I've read the policy terms. My father. Stop. And Elliot stopped. I stood in that hallway for what I have since estimated was close to 5 minutes, though it might have been 3 and might have been 10. My gloves were 20 feet away. I did not retrieve them. I stood completely still and I held what I had just heard inside me the way you hold very cold water in your hands, carefully, knowing it will eventually tell you something about itself. Then I walked back out through the kitchen door without my gloves, and I rode home barehanded in December in Vermont, which was not advisable, and I sat in my apartment and looked at the wall for a long time. What I was looking at was not my future, it was my past. I was looking at the Christmas dinner before this one, when Elliot had mentioned, casually, that he'd started researching estate planning frameworks for family members in high-risk professions. I had thought it was an academic interest at the time. I was looking at the previous spring, when he had asked me, ostensibly in passing, whether I had updated my beneficiary designations since starting at Ridgecrest. I had thought it was the kind of question an administratively minded brother asks. I was looking at the Google alert I had found on his laptop, the alert for my name, which I had filed away as vaguely creepy but possibly benign. None of it was benign. None of it had ever been benign. I changed my phone number the next day. I mentioned the conversation to Dr. Osei, who sat with it for a moment with the particular stillness she brought to things that warranted it, and then asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I said I didn't know yet. She said that was an honest answer. We talked about it for several sessions after that, circling it from different angles, and I never came to a conclusion that satisfied me. There was no clean action available. I couldn't report a conversation. I couldn't prove intent from research. I could only watch and keep the record and continue building the life that was mine regardless of what my family had decided about its value. 8 months later, I hit black ice on Route 9 and ended up in a hospital bed. I understood lying there on day 2 with my eyes closed and Brianne's footsteps receding down the hall that I had been given something extraordinary, the ability to hear what my family actually thought of me. Most people never get this. Most people go through their entire lives with a family that has failed them, knowing it imperfectly, sensing it in half signals and near misses, never getting the full direct transmission of the truth. I was getting the full transmission. The accident had created conditions under which my family believed they could be honest, and they were being honest, and the honesty was both worse and more useful than I could have anticipated. I decided to let it continue. This decision was not simple, and it was not made in a moment. It assembled itself over the course of day 2 and into day 3, as I lay in that bed and thought through the implications of what I had heard and what I suspected I was about to hear, and what I could do with it if I listened long enough. I had 2 cracked ribs and a concussion and a broken leg. I was in a trauma ward. I was technically vulnerable, and yet I had never felt more capable in my life, because the particular skill I had spent 25 years developing, the skill of reading a room from a position of apparent absence, of understanding the dynamics around you while appearing not to be present for them, was exactly the skill that the situation required. So I lay still, and I breathed slowly, and I kept my face arranged in the careful neutrality of unconsciousness, and I listened. On the morning of day 3, the footsteps came. 2 sets. The first was Elliot's, measured, slightly deliberate, the footsteps of someone who was practiced at approaching things carefully. The second was my mother's, the familiar sound of her shoes on linoleum, a soft leather sole, a sound I had been able to identify since childhood. I had not heard her in the hallway before this. She had not come the first 2 days. I understood that the delay had been strategic, not emotional. She had been waiting for something, for word of my condition, for Elliot's assessment of the situation, for the logistics to become clear enough that a visit made sense. The door opened. Both of them entered. I regulated my breathing, slow and even. I had told myself before they arrived that I would not let my heart rate spike. I had been wrong to tell myself this. Still out cold, Elliot said. I knew his voice the way you know the smell of a house you grew up in, involuntarily, completely, with the full weight of everything it has ever been associated with. I kept my eyes closed. My mother said, good. A pause. The soft sound of her settling into the chair beside my bed, the same chair that Brianne had pointed out to visiting family, the one designated for people who wanted to be close to someone they loved. Good. She said it twice. I cataloged that. Good. Meaning she was glad I was unconscious. Good. Meaning this was the preferred situation. Maybe this will finally teach her a lesson, she said. I want to be very clear about what it took to keep my body still in that moment. It was not easy. The instinct to react, to move, to open my eyes, to say something that would force her to look at me as a conscious person was physical. It was in my chest and my hands and the muscles of my jaw. I breathed through it. 4 counts in, hold, out, riding that death trap, my mother said. Not to me, to Elliot, to herself, to whatever audience she imagined when she composed these judgments. At 25, she threw away law school to play paramedic. All those years, all that money your father and I put into her education, and she ends up crashing a motorcycle on the way home from a night shift in the middle of nowhere. I had not thrown away law school. My mother had wanted me to apply to law school. I had not applied because I had never wanted to be a lawyer, had never expressed any interest in being a lawyer, had in fact told my mother explicitly and on multiple occasions that I did not want to be a lawyer. These facts had not succeeded in replacing, in her narration of my life, the version where I had abandoned a promising legal career for reasons she could attribute to my consistent perversity. She never had the brains for law anyway, Elliot said. said. He said it with the boredom of someone making a factual observation about landscape. You always knew that. A pause. I heard him move, his shoes on the linoleum, a restless pacing that I recognized from childhood, from the times he was working up to saying something he wanted to say, but hadn't decided yet how to frame. If she doesn't wake up, he said, the life insurance pays out. My mother said, someone might hear you. Her voice was careful, not horrified, careful. She did not say stop. She's not waking up, Elliot said. Look at her. The nurses are telling us she could be in this condition for weeks. Brain swelling. The concussion is more severe than they initially thought. He paused. That's what they're saying. This was, to be direct about it, a lie. The nurses had said nothing of the kind. Brienne had told Elliot, in response to his inquiry at the nurses' station, that I was resting comfortably and that my condition was being monitored. That was the extent of it. But Elliot was constructing a narrative, as he always had, assembling the facts that served the architecture and discarding the ones that didn't, building the version of reality that produced the outcome he wanted. He had always been good at this. It was his primary skill. 200,000, he said. Plus, whatever she has in savings. She's been working 2 years. She doesn't spend money on anything. She doesn't have a car payment. She doesn't travel. There could be 25, 30,000 in that account. You looked at her account? My mother said. I've looked at what's accessible. The insurance documentation is accessible. It's still set to flow to the estate. She's never changed the beneficiary. I checked again last week. Before my accident. He had checked last week, which was before my accident, which meant he had been monitoring this not in response to a crisis, but in preparation for one. There's also the settlement, Elliot said. His voice had taken on a quality I recognized, the slightly quickened pace of someone getting into the details of something they'd been thinking about for a long time. From the motorcycle company. I've been looking at the accident report, and that model has had brake failure incidents flagged in 3 other liability cases in the Northeast. I filed a preliminary complaint with the manufacturer this morning. The brakes on my bike had been fine. I know this because I had done my standard pre-ride check before leaving Ridgecrest Station at the end of my shift, the same check I did every shift. Fluid levels, brake pressure, cable tension, tire pressure. I know motorcycles. I maintain my own bike. The brakes had been functioning exactly as they should have been. My accident had been caused by black ice on a curve that channeled cold air from the adjacent meadow and froze before the rest of the road. It was a known hazard on that section of Route 9. I had ridden it carefully 300 times. The one time I hit it wrong, at 42 miles per hour, on a curve that offered no correction margin, the bike went down. That is the complete mechanical explanation. Elliot had filed a complaint claiming faulty brakes before I was declared stable, before I had even been in the building 12 hours. He had researched the liability exposure, identified the relevant legal precedents, and initiated a claim against a manufacturer for a defect that did not exist. How much? My mother said. Conservatively, 50. If they settle quickly to avoid a wrongful death suit, possibly more. These companies don't want the publicity. We'd have to be careful, she said. She said this with the inflection of someone who was not objecting to the substance of a plan, only to its execution. The careful was not about whether, it was about how. The family makes the humane choice, Elliot said. He was composing the narrative now, the one he'd present to the world. I could hear him working it out. The family makes the decision that any loving family would make. We don't let her suffer on machines. We let her go with dignity. A pause. People will understand. They'll respect us for it. When? My mother said. A few more days. Let it look natural. Let the situation develop. I lay in that bed and I thought about what it takes to produce a person who can say those things in that room. What specific combination of factors, greed, entitlement, long practice at rationalizing self-interest as something else, enables a human being to stand 3 feet from their sister's hospital bed and discuss the timing of her death with the precision of someone scheduling a business meeting. I tried to locate the inner logic of it, the architecture of belief that would make that conversation feel normal. I could not find it. I have been looking for it in various ways for several years now, and I have not found it. They stayed another 15 minutes. My mother touched my hand once before she left. 2 fingers on the back of my hand. Light, brief, and given the context. Possibly the most disturbing thing that happened in that room. I lay still for another hour after their footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Then I pressed the call button. When Brienne arrived, I said, "Can you make sure that visitors are logged? Anyone who comes to this room, I want a name, a time of arrival, a time of departure." She looked at me with the measured attention of an experienced nurse confronting an unusual request from a patient who should, by all rights, be resting. "Sure, honey," she said. "And don't change what you're telling them about my condition," I said. "When they ask, keep saying what you've been saying." She held my gaze for a moment. "What have I been saying? That I'm resting." "Okay," she said. "And Brienne, I need to speak to a patient advocate, someone with legal knowledge, not a social worker. Tonight, if possible." She nodded. She left. She came back 2 hours later with a card for a woman named Sandra Vale, and the information that Sandra could be reached that evening. Day 4 brought visitors I had not anticipated. My cousin Nadia arrived at 10 in the morning with her husband Garrett. Nadia was 31, my mother's younger sister's oldest daughter, a woman who had been held up at family gatherings throughout my childhood as the template for correctly executed success. She had a business degree from Middlebury, a house in South Burlington's most desirable neighborhood, a husband who sold commercial real estate and dressed in the particular way that announced the price of everything he wore. We were not close. We had not been in the same room in 3 years. The last time I had had seen her had been at a family gathering 2 summers prior, where she had spoken to me for approximately 4 minutes about how interesting it was that I had chosen to work in emergency services, in the specific tone that suggested she found it more puzzling than interesting. They had apparently heard about the accident through family channels. They had come from Burlington. They were dressed, as I have noted, in the clothes of people who had considered the occasion carefully. Nadia wore a blazer. Garrett wore a tie. These were people who had dressed for my potential death with the same attention they brought to anything that might produce a photograph. I stayed still. I breathed slowly. I listened. "She's smaller than I remembered," Nadia said. "She said it the way you'd note a property had fewer square feet than listed." "What's the apartment situation?" Garrett said. I heard him moving around the room with the quiet, assessing motion of someone inventorying a space. "1 bedroom. She rents. Nothing major. Month-to-month lease, I think." Nadia's voice. "The savings?" Elliot said 25 to 30,000, possibly more. "She doesn't have expenses." "And the insurance flows to the estate?" "Yes." "Elliot's already—" "Yes." A pause. Garrett made a sound I can only describe as the sound of someone processing arithmetic. "Good planning," he said. Not a compliment to me, a compliment to the situation. He was complimenting the convenient alignment of my potential death with their financial interests. They took a photograph. I heard it, the soft shutter sound of a phone camera. And I nearly moved, nearly betrayed the whole thing, nearly sat up and looked at them and said what I was thinking. I held it together. I counted to 10. I breathed. They left 40 minutes later talking about catching the early drive back to Burlington. They discussed traffic on 89. They discussed whether they had time for dinner in Montpelier. They spoke about me in the past tense for the second half of their visit, which told me, with more precision than anything else, what they had already decided. Aunt Vera arrived that afternoon with her brother Harold. I had not seen Vera since the trial. I had not seen her since the day she sat in the gallery and watched me testify about what her husband had done, and looked at me with an expression that I had spent considerable time trying to categorize. It was not hatred. It was something more complex than hatred. It was the look of a woman who understood on some level that I was telling the truth and who had decided, for reasons she would carry to her grave, that her loyalty to her husband mattered more. "Poor thing," she said when she entered my room. She was performing for Harold, I thought, or for some audience she carried with her at all times. She always was so reckless. That motorcycle, those hours. I said to Walter, I said to people years ago that she had a self-destructive streak. "She did," Harold confirmed. "Walter tried so hard with her," she said. "He really did. He took a special interest in her. He spent time with her. He was patient. And then she repaid him. She repaid everything he did for her with lies that put him in prison." I want to tell you that I was past feeling those words. I want to tell you that the years of therapy and distance and careful processing had metabolized the particular venom of that specific narration, the one where my testimony was lies, where Walter's abuse was care, where I had destroyed the family rather than told the truth about it. I want to tell you, it no longer reached me. It reached me. It always reaches me. The old cold rage moved through me the way it always had. Not a flash of heat, but a tide. Slow and total and geological. I breathed through it. I kept my face arranged. I stayed still. "Maybe if she doesn't wake up," Harold said, "it's for the best. For everyone. For everyone." He meant for Walter, who was in prison because of me. He meant for the family's peace, for their social standing, for the version of themselves they wanted to be able to maintain. He meant for everyone whose version of events was more comfortable when I was not in the world to contradict it. They left after 20 minutes. Then my father came. I hadn't been in the same room as my father since a gas station encounter in Montpelier the previous spring, a collision so accidental and so laden with things neither of us could say that we had both done the thing where you nod and look away and locate something urgent elsewhere. He had aged. I knew this not from seeing him but from the sound of him, the slightly changed rhythm of his footsteps, the creak in his left knee that had always announced him on the stairs of the house on Aldermore Road, the way he settled his weight into the chair beside my bed with a heaviness that hadn't been there 3 years before. He sat. He was quiet. I have thought about that silence many times since then. What was in it? Whether there was grief in it? Whether some part of him was looking at me in that bed and feeling something other than the calcification of resentment that I knew from experience was his dominant mode. I held the silence carefully. I let it contain what it needed to contain. I gave it the full space of not knowing. Then he opened his mouth. "You broke this family apart," he said. Not, "I'm glad you're alive." Not, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." Not even the cold, bureaucratic version of parental concern, the "how are you," the "what did the doctor say." He sat beside my hospital bed, and what he had brought me, after all the silence, was that, "My brother is in prison because of you. My brother, who I grew up with, who I have known for 50 years, he is in prison, and his wife is trying to hold her life together, and their kids are trying to hold their lives together. And you stood up in that courtroom and you said what you said, and everything we built was gone. Everything my parents worked for, everything I worked for, 40 years of reputation and standing in that town, and 5 minutes of testimony. 4 days, not 5 minutes, 4 days. And it was gone. That's what you did. That's what you chose to do." He stood. I heard the chair scrape back. I heard him straighten his jacket, the way he always did before he left rooms he'd decided were done with. "Elliot has prepared documents," he said. "Medical documents. Legal documents. If your condition deteriorates, we have made it clear that we do not wish to intervene. The family is in agreement. We believe this is what you would want." He left. He did not touch touch me. I lay in the dark of my closed eyes and I thought about the man who had driven me to school on the days my mother couldn't, who had come to exactly 3 parent-teacher conferences in my life, who had coached my little league team for 1 season and then stopped because he found it frustrating, who had been present in my life as a specific, limited kind of presence, functional, predictable, entirely incapable of depth. I had never expected warmth from my father. I had stopped expecting it when I was about 12 and had adjusted my understanding of what was available accordingly. What I had not expected was this: the clean, formal, almost administrative quality of his betrayal, the paperwork, the documents, the "we are in agreement." I pressed the call button. Sandra Vale arrived at 9 that night. She was 50, gray-haired, and methodical, with the particular efficiency of someone who had been delivering bad news to people in bad situations for a long time. She did not express surprise. She did not offer comfort beyond the comfort of competence, which was actually what I needed. She had copies of the documents Elliot had filed. She spread them on the tray table beside my bed and walked me through them with the systematic patience of a teacher who expects her student to understand. The medical power of attorney, filed the morning of my accident, not 3 months prior, as it was backdated to indicate, but the actual morning of my accident at 9:47 a.m., before I had even been admitted to Ridgecrest. The notarization stamp was from a firm in Burlington that had ceased operations in February, 8 months before my accident. The guardianship petition, filed in the 2nd Family Court District, citing, and she read directly, a documented history of psychological instability and behavioral dysfunction that has historically impaired the subject's capacity for sound judgment and independent decision-making. Supporting documentation, a letter from a licensed therapist that bore a license number she had run through the Vermont licensing database and found to correspond to a therapist who had retired in 2019 and had, according to the licensing board, no active patients and no practice. A statement from my father. A statement from my mother. He didn't build this in the last 3 days, I said. No, she said. He built it before the accident. The filing timestamps confirm that the foundational documents predate your accident by a minimum of 8 months, she said, possibly longer. There are digital footprints the FBI's forensic team is still working through. FBI. It was the first time she had used that word. Agent Diane Voss, Sandra said, Burlington Field Office. She's been monitoring the financial activities associated with your family since Walter Pruitt's conviction. There are irregularities in the estate management, in insurance documentation, in several transactions involving accounts your brother controls that she's been building a case around for 2 years. She paused. Your accident accelerated her timeline considerably. I looked at her. What does she want? She wants the conspiracy documented in real time, on video, with identifiable participants, making identifiable decisions. Sandra looked at the documents on the tray table. What she needs is for your family to make the choice they've been planning to make, in a controlled environment, where every element of the decision is captured. I was quiet for a moment. If you discharge yourself tomorrow, I said, what happens to the guardianship petition? You're clearly competent. The petition fails. The power of attorney is challengeable with a finding of fraud. You walk away, and what you have is documented conversations between family members in a hospital room, which is valuable but not sufficient for the conspiracy charges she needs. But if you stay, and if your family makes the decision they're planning to make in the presence of medical staff, with the full legal apparatus of the power of attorney deployed, then you have an attempted murder committed in a hospital, documented by hospital staff, witnessed by law enforcement present in the building. She looked at me. Then you have everything. And Dr. Reeves has been in contact with Agent Voss since day 1, she said. He identified the pattern within the first 24 hours of your admission and reached out to her directly. He's been coordinating everything since. She paused. He wants to talk to you tonight. I sat with that for a moment. I was in a hospital bed with 2 cracked ribs and a broken leg and a concussion, and the information I had just received was the following. My brother had built a legal apparatus designed to kill me. The apparatus predated my accident by at least 8 months. The FBI had been monitoring my family for 2 years, and the attending physician who had been treating me since my admission had been in contact with that FBI agent since day 1 of my hospitalization. I was simultaneously more protected than I had been in years, and more completely alone than I had ever felt. There's something else you should understand, Sandra said. She was gathering the documents, aligning them, the precise movements of someone organizing things they didn't want to leave disordered. The guardianship petition Elliot filed, it's not just about this hospitalization. If it proceeds, and if any court were to take it seriously, it would give your brother ongoing oversight of your personal and financial decisions indefinitely, unless you successfully challenged it. The mental incompetency framing he's used is specifically designed to be difficult to rebut without a full psychological evaluation, which requires time, which requires you to be engaging with the system rather than ignoring it. She looked at me. He wasn't just planning for if you were unconscious. He was planning for if you woke up. I had understood this, but hearing it stated plainly by someone else, someone who had read the documents, who understood the legal mechanics, who was telling me this not as speculation, but as the product of an afternoon's work, made it more solid, more real, more completely what it was. He had 2 tracks, I said. Yes, if you stayed unconscious, the power of attorney let them end your life. If you woke up, the guardianship petition made you legally incompetent, stripped your ability to discharge yourself, and let them control your care from a different angle. She paused. Either way, say. You were the problem that was going to be solved. I looked at the ceiling. I had looked at that ceiling for 4 days. I knew it the way you know a face. And the insurance claim he filed this morning, I said, before I'm dead. Fraudulent filing to obtain insurance proceeds. Federal offense. Filing it before the death is established is the kind of mistake prosecutors love because it removes all ambiguity about intent. She said it with the calm satisfaction of someone who had seen enough imperfect crimes to appreciate the gift of an obvious one. He was impatient. He was always impatient, I said. She closed her folder. She looked at me with something that was not quite sympathy but was the professional cousin of it, the recognition of someone in a genuinely terrible situation, held without minimizing it. You understand that what Agent Voss is proposing carries risk. I'm a paramedic, I said. I've been in situations that carried risk. This is different from a crash scene. Yes, I said, it is. I thought about what I wanted to say next and how to say it accurately. The difference is that at a crash scene, the risk comes from the chaos. What happened, what might happen next, what the variables are, you manage it in real time with incomplete information. What's being proposed here is the opposite. Every variable is controlled. Every element is prepared. The only thing I have to do is hold still for 30 seconds and then let the people who have been doing their jobs for 2 years finish what they started. Sandra looked at me for a moment. I've represented a lot of people in difficult situations, she said. I want you to know that what's happened to you is not normal. Even within the category of family legal disputes, even within the category of estate fraud, what has been built around you is remarkable in its completeness. It's premeditation. She paused. Most people would not have gotten this far. Most people would not have listened for 4 days and kept their composure and then made the request you made for a patient advocate and a visitor log. I grew up in a family that required me to be good at this, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. She left at 11:15. I lay in the dark, and I thought about my mother's 2 fingers on the back of my hand. I thought about the gravy boat she had set down on the kitchen table all those years ago when I told her about Walter. I thought about the way Elliot had said to Dr. Reeves, how long does it take? And the way my father had said we already said goodbye, and the way Nadia had said she looks peaceful, and the way Garrett had said good planning. I arranged these moments in chronological order, and I looked at them as a sequence, and I understood that they were not separate events. They were chapters in a single story that had been developing for years, moving toward a resolution that my family had been writing without my knowledge. I had been the subject of that story. Tonight, I was going to become its author. Dr. Marcus Reeves came to my room at 11. He closed the door. He checked my chart as he did every time he entered, and then he sat in the chair beside my bed and looked at me directly in the way of someone who was tired of looking at me sideways. I know you've been awake, he said, since day 2 at minimum. Your heart rate spikes every time specific visitors speak. Your pupillary response during our checks has been inconsistent with your supposed level of consciousness. Your neurological scans show a grade 2 concussion. Real, significant, but not remotely sufficient to explain a sustained vegetative state. He looked at me. I've been waiting for you to make a decision. I opened my eyes. He looked at me for a long moment, and in that look was something I have thought about many times since. Not pity, not horror, not the professional concern you might expect from a doctor whose patient had just revealed she'd been faking unconsciousness for 2 days. What was in it was something more like recognition, the look of someone who had suspected the truth and was relieved to have it confirmed. Agent Voss, he said. Sandra told me, I said. She's been in my office twice. She's been in this hospital, in some capacity, since the morning of your admission. He leaned back. She needs what I think you're already considering giving her. Tell me the medical reality of ventilator withdrawal in a patient with my actual condition, I said. He looked at me. If they pull the tube, I said. How long can I hold without it being detectable? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you're asking as a paramedic. I'm asking as someone who needs to know. 30 seconds, he said. Absolute maximum before your CO2 levels produce involuntary response that the monitors would flag. With your conditioning, you're young, healthy, your concussion is grade 2, your lung function is unimpaired. 30 seconds is achievable. At 20 seconds, you'll want to breathe. At 25, it will feel necessary. At 30, it will feel imperative. I can hold 30 seconds, I said. I know you can, he said. I've been reading your chart for 4 days. You're one of the more self-controlled patients I've treated. A pause. I'll be in the room. If anything goes wrong, if your body overrides your decision at any point, I intervene immediately. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. Agent Voss will be at the funeral home with a team. They'll have everything within an hour of the pronouncement. I thought about this for a long time. Not the 30 seconds. That part I was sure about. What I thought about was what came after. The hour in the bag. The body bag, breathing, the transfer, the funeral home, the world where my family believed they had won, for the length of time it would take to bring them in. The 60 minutes in which I would be, as far as anyone outside this room knew, dead. Okay, I said. There's something else, he said. I waited. The accident report. I've had your motorcycle's preliminary inspection data reviewed by a friend at the Vermont State Police, off the record, because something about the accident description bothered me from the beginning. He paused. The trajectory of the fall is inconsistent with a standard black ice incident. I looked at him. Black ice causes a gradual loss of traction, typically a low side lean with a slow slide. The vehicle's contact pattern on the road surface suggests an abrupt drop. The left side took the initial impact as if the front brake brake released suddenly. Pressure loss rather than traction loss. The brakes were fine when I left the station, I said. I know, he said. Agent Voss knows. The bike is going to be re-examined by a forensic mechanic with the FBI's lab, but I wanted you to understand, before tomorrow, that what you're doing here may be bigger than what you know. I lay still for a long time after he left. The fluorescent light buzzed. The corridor outside was quiet in the particular way of hospital corridors at midnight. Not silent, but subdued, operating at a lower register. I thought about the morning I'd left the station, the ride home, the curve on Route 9. I thought about the bike going out from under me, the specificity of the sensation, the way it had felt less like sliding and more like dropping. I had filed this away as the subjective distortion that happens in high-speed accidents, where perception compresses and expands unreliably. I had not, until this moment, considered that the dropping was precisely what it felt like, because that was precisely what it was. I thought about my bike. I knew that bike the way I knew my own hands. Its weight distribution, the feel of its brakes at full pressure versus light pressure, the way it handled in cold weather versus warm, the sound it made when the engine was perfectly tuned. I had bought it used at 23, and I had serviced it myself, learned its mechanical language, understood its components the way a careful person understands any tool they depend on. The brakes had been perfect. Not probably fine, not functionally adequate, perfect. I had checked them before every shift for 2 years. I had checked them the morning of my accident. They had been fine when I left the station. They had not been fine on Route 9. I thought about Elliot's voice at Christmas dinner, the ease with which he had discussed the EMS carrier's accidental death laws. If she's killed while in transit to or from a shift, on her bike. He had known I rode to work. He had known my schedule. He had known where I lived and where I parked, and that the parking area had no cameras, because he had been to my apartment twice in the years I'd lived there. Once to drop off a birthday card from my mother that she apparently hadn't mailed, and once to return a book my father had borrowed 3 years prior, which Elliot had driven to Hardin to deliver in person for reasons I had never understood. I understood them now. He had been inventorying. He had been learning the geography of my life the way a person learns geography before they need to navigate it. He had been to my apartment. He had stood in my parking area. He had seen the bike. 8 months of preparation, the documents, the research, the fake therapist letter, the fraudulent notarization, the legal research on the motorcycle company's liability exposure, all of it ready. And then a night when the bike was unattended, in an unlocked space with no cameras, and a man who had been planning this for 8 months, and who had the patience and the nerve and the complete moral flatness required to do what came next. I lay in that bed and I understood that what had happened to me was not an accident that had become an opportunity. It was a plan that had, through the specific alignment of bad luck and human deceit, nearly worked. I had one night to sit with this understanding before the final act. I used it. I slept, which surprised me. I had thought the knowledge would keep me awake indefinitely, but the body has its own requirements, and mine required sleep, and I gave it to the extent I was able. I woke at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark for an hour thinking about my grandmother, about the blueberry picking, about the specific quality of morning light at that cottage in Grafton, and the smell of pancakes on a wood stove. I thought about these things deliberately, as an act of self-maintenance, because I have learned that the mind requires something to hold onto when it is processing things too large to hold entirely, and what mine reached for was Nana Ruth's kitchen. I found it. It was enough. At 5 a.m. I heard the early shift nurses beginning their rounds. I heard Brienne's voice in the corridor. She was working a double, apparently, the particular exhausted efficiency of someone running on their second wind. I heard the familiar rhythms of the floor, and I felt, for the first time in 4 days, a clear and quiet resolve. Not courage exactly, something simpler. The knowledge of what needed to happen, and the acceptance of being the person who would be there when it happened. I was ready. The next morning, Dr. Reeves spoke to the family. He called the meeting for 10 a.m. He brought them into the small family consultation room across from my ward, the one with the round table and the box of tissues and the motivational print on the wall that said something about strength I had never been able to read completely from my angle. My mother, Elliot, my father, Nadia and Garrett, who had returned from Burlington overnight, which told me they had been expecting this call. Aunt Vera had remained in the area, staying at a local motel, which told me the same thing. I was not in the room. I was in my bed, breathing slowly, listening to the hospital. Brienne came in once to check on me and looked at me for a moment before leaving. I think she knew, in the particular way that experienced nurses sometimes know things they haven't been told. She didn't ask. She did the check and she left, and I was grateful for that. Dr. Reeves told them that overnight imaging had revealed increased intracranial pressure, that the concussion was developing in an atypical pattern, that current standard of care recommended initiating ventilator support as a precautionary measure. He said this in the careful, measured language of medicine, precise without being alarming, factual without being cold. He told them that given the power of attorney on file, the family had the right to weigh in on this decision. He explained the process. The family would be consulted at each stage. Their documented wishes would be part of the medical record, and if they wished to discuss prognosis further, he was available. My mother said, "Whatever you recommend, doctor." She said it with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed deferring to authority when deference served her interests. It was perfect. It was exactly the right performance for the audience she believed she was performing for. Elliot said, "We trust you completely." His voice was warm, concerned, entirely composed. He had the bearing of a devoted family family member. He had been practicing this for months. They were brought to my room while the ventilator was set up. I lay still. I felt the tube going in, and I categorized the sensation with the professional detachment of someone who had inserted and removed tubes in patients and understood what the procedure felt like from the clinician's side. It was not pleasant. It was tolerable. I controlled my response. I breathed with the machine. They watched. All of them. I could feel the room's quality change when they were all in it. The specific atmospheric pressure of multiple people concentrated around a fixed point, each of them carrying what they were carrying, each of them believing what they believed. She looks peaceful, Nadia said. I have thought about those 3 words many times. She looks peaceful. The complete collapse of the distinction between death and peace. The comfortable slide between the two, as though one were simply the perfected form of the other. They left. The ventilator breathed for me. I breathed around it, careful and minimal. 6 hours passed. Dr. Reeves came back at 4 in the afternoon and called the family in again. The situation had not improved, he said. The pressure was not responding. Prolonged ventilator support in patients with this type of injury carried its own risks. The family needed to consider what the patient would want. What the patient would want. I was the patient. I was 15 feet away, fully conscious, fully present, entirely capable of speaking for myself. And the legal architecture that my brother had constructed around me, the power of attorney, the guardianship petition, the prepared documentation, had made me, in the eyes of the institutional process, someone whose wishes were represented by others. I had become, through the application of bureaucratic fraud, a person without legal voice. This is what I want people to understand about what happened in that room. It was not a simple act of greed overcoming love. It was a system. A constructed system with multiple components that had been built carefully over months, perhaps years, each piece designed to interlock with the others, each document designed to remove one more avenue of recourse. The fraud was not opportunistic. It was engineered, and it required me to be unconscious. The moment I opened my eyes and spoke, the whole thing collapsed. The power of attorney was challengeable by a competent patient. The guardianship petition required a finding of incompetency. Everything they had built was contingent on my silence, so they had needed me to be silent. And for 4 days, I had given them exactly what they needed, for reasons of my own. My mother said, "We think she would want to be free. Not, she would want to live. Not, she would want to fight. She would want to be free from the machines, from the hospital, from the particular kind of life she had chosen, the life on the motorcycle, the life in the small apartment, the life they had never considered adequate." Elliot squeezed my hand. He said loudly and clearly, loudly enough to be sure the doctor heard, "We know this is what you'd want." He squeezed again. "To be free." Then he said to Dr. Reeves, quietly but not quietly enough, "How long does it take?" My father said, "We already said goodbye." Dr. Reeves said the family might want a moment. My mother said, "We're ready." Elliot said, "Yes." The ventilator tube came out. I held completely still. Every nerve ending I had was making a very specific argument about why I should breathe. The argument was physiological, ancient, not subject to reason. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The first 10 seconds were manageable. I had told myself they would be, and they were. 11, 12, 13. In the second 10, I felt the CO2 building, the mild pressure that would, in another 10 seconds, become something much less mild. I breathed in the very smallest measure possible, the bottom of my capacity, the minimum exchange, nothing visible to anyone in the room. 21, 22, 23. The urgency built. It was not exactly pain. It was something more compelling than pain, the body's oldest instruction, the one that does not take no for an answer. I gave it as little as I could while giving it enough. "She's not breathing," Dr. Reeves said. His voice was completely neutral, a professional observation. "Losing cardiac rhythm." I heard the room change, the sound of it. I have worked in emergency medicine long enough to know every register of human response to death, and what I heard in that room was not grief releasing. It was anticipation completing, the held breath of people waiting for a transaction to close, the exhale that says, "Done." Elliot was asking about cremation before Dr. Reeves finished the sentence, specifically expedited cremation. He cited a preference for simplicity. He cited what she would have wanted. He asked whether the death certificate could be processed the same day. My mother asked about the hospital's grief counseling resources, not for herself, she clarified, but because she wanted to be able to refer family members. She asked this within 90 seconds of my official time of death. The administrative distance of the question, the precision of it, the completeness of her readiness. These things told me with a finality I had been working toward for days, that there was nothing left to mourn in my relationship with this woman. Whatever had been real in it, and something had been real, I believe that, I have to believe that, had been subordinated so completely and for so long to whatever need she was meeting with this, that there was nothing recoverable. I was the problem she had always been afraid of, and the problem was going to be resolved. Garrett was in the corridor asking someone about estate filing procedures. Dr. Reeves called my time of death at 2:47 p.m. I was in the bag for 78 minutes. I'm not going to tell you that it was fine. I am going to tell you that I have had harder experiences, and that the discipline required to remain still and controlled in an enclosed, dark space, while breathing very carefully through a straw of available air, is not comfortable, but is achievable. I have had worse. I have had worse in rooms I couldn't leave. Agent Voss opened the bag in the prep room of the Hardin Valley Funeral Home. She was shorter than I had imagined from the phone call Sandra had described. 5'4", blazer, Reading glasses she wore low on her nose. She looked at me for a moment and said, "How are you doing?" "Ready to be done," I said. "Almost done," she said. She showed me what they had. On a table beside the preparation table, which was cold and steel and the particular kind of impersonal that all body-adjacent surfaces are, she laid out the documentation. The insurance claim Elliot had submitted. The timestamp, 1:15 p.m. The ventilator withdrawal, 2:47 p.m. He had filed the claim 92 minutes before my official time of death. He had submitted paperwork to receive payment for my death before I was dead, before even the decision had been made. Before the family meeting Dr. Reeves had called, he had been ready. He had been waiting. "Your mother has a meeting Thursday with a financial advisor in Burlington who specializes in international wire transfer facilitation," Voss said. "She booked it 2 days after your accident. The advisor has been flagged in 2 prior estate fraud investigations. Nadia and Garrett booked flights to Portugal last month," she said. "The Lisbon itinerary includes 3 property viewings. The properties are in the range of 2.5 to 3.8 million euros." I looked at her. She looked at me. "There's more," she said. "The medical power of attorney Elliot filed. We have the actual execution date from the notary firm's digital records. Not the date on the document, which was backdated 3 months, but the actual digital timestamp of when the notarization was processed." She paused. "It was processed 8 months before your accident, simultaneously with the initial filing of the motorcycle liability research that Elliot contracted through a private legal research service. 8 months before my accident, Elliot had known my precise payout. He had prepared the legal framework to control my care. He had commissioned research on the motorcycle company's liability exposure. The preliminary accident reconstruction," she said, "suggests the brake failure pattern is inconsistent with black ice. The forensic mechanic is doing the full workup, but the leading hypothesis is deliberate interference with the brake line." She was watching me very carefully. "I need to ask you about your bike's storage arrangements," I told her. "The parking area, no cameras, the unlocked storage, the fact that I kept to a consistent schedule and that anyone who knew my shifts would know exactly when the bike would be unattended and for how long." She made notes. She did not express surprise. "We'll process the bike. The results will be part of the evidentiary package. Whether it produces charges on top of the conspiracy counts is a prosecutorial question, not mine to make." She looked up from her notes. "I want to be honest with you about something. The evidentiary bar for attempted murder through vehicle tampering is higher than for the conspiracy charges we already have. We may have strong evidence of tampering and not be able to charge it." "I know," I said. "Does that?" "I know," I said again. "The law knows what it can prove. I know what I know." She held my gaze for a moment. "The arrests are happening now," she said. "All of them. Every person who was in that room and several who weren't." I will not pretend I felt nothing when she said that. I will not perform the equanimity I didn't have. What I felt in that moment, lying on a steel table in a funeral home, was something that took me several years to accurately identify, and that I have finally decided to call the specific grief of having been right. The grief of having known, and having lived with knowing, and having been correct in everything you feared. There is no triumph in it. There is relief, a version of relief, but it is the relief of a pain ending, not the relief of a good thing beginning. It is the exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for years, not someone who has arrived somewhere good. My mother was arrested at the hospital's main entrance. She was speaking to an administrator about obtaining a copy of my death certificate, the official document that would formalize, on paper, what she had participated in making happen, when Agent Voss's colleague approached her. She said, according to the report I read 6 months later, "This is Mara's fault." She said it as a first response, before anything else, before a lawyer, before anything. It was the first thing she said. I have thought about that a great deal, the complete instantaneity of it, the way the accusation arrived before the denial, before the disbelief, before any performance of innocence. The accusation was the truest thing she had in her, and it came out first. Elliot was arrested in the parking garage. He was on the phone with the insurance company when the agents approached. He was in the middle of initiating the claims process in real time. He ended the call with the automated system, looked at the agent and said, "I want an attorney." He said it with the composure of someone who had planned for this possibility, the way he planned for everything, with a contingency, with a prepared response, with the unshakable self-belief of someone who had never, in his life, genuinely believed he would be caught. Nadia was in the hospital lobby. She cried. Garrett asked for a lawyer before his rights were read, which the arresting agent noted in the report with a detachment I found darkly satisfying. My father was not arrested that day. My father had signed the documents and made the statement and been present in the room, but he had not been the architect. He had been the legitimizing body, the paternal signature that gave everything the appearance of family consensus rather than individual fraud. The full accounting of his participation took 6 additional months of financial forensics to establish. He was charged eventually, on lesser counts, and he pled. He is not in prison. He lives in Wentworth. I do not know what he tells himself. I have stopped trying to imagine it. Vera received 3 years probation. Harold received a fine. The financial advisor my mother had booked was investigated and charged separately. The private legal research firm Elliot had commissioned to build his liability case against the motorcycle company was investigated for its role in the fraudulent filing. The full accounting of what my family had built, the insurance fraud, the forged documents, the financial maneuvering, the long preparation, produced a legal process that took 18 months from my time of official death to the final sentencing. Elliot received 18 years. He will be 61 when he's eligible for parole. My mother received 15. She pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in the second degree. At her sentencing, Judge Patricia Delaney, a woman whose face I had only seen in photographs, but who I now think of with something approaching gratitude, told my mother that the evidence did not support her claim that she had been acting under her son's influence without full understanding of the plan's intent. The motorcycle forensic examination concluded 5 months after my discharge. I will not state the finding as a certainty here because the legal status of one component of that finding is still, in a technical sense, pending. What I will say is this: the brake line on my CB500F showed evidence of interference that is not consistent with natural wear, mechanical failure, or impact damage. It is consistent with deliberate manipulation of a specific fitting that would produce pressure failure under sustained braking load, the kind of braking load you apply when you see ice on a curve at 42 miles per hour. The evidence was reviewed by 2 independent forensic mechanics who reached the same conclusion. Whether that conclusion produces a charge of attempted murder in addition to the conspiracy charges that are already adjudicated is a prosecutorial question. It remains open. I have made peace with the possibility that it will remain open. I know what I know. Sandra Vale helped me access a program that works with individuals who have faced sustained family-based threats to their physical safety. It is not witness protection in the dramatic sense. It is quieter, more bureaucratic, and involves an extraordinary amount of paperwork, which, given the role that paperwork had played in almost killing me, I approached with a certain dark appreciation. By November, I had a new name, a new social security number, a new state of residence. I had, in the legal sense, a new identity. In every other sense, I was the same person, the same history, the same knowledge, the same losses, the same small specific things I loved, and the specific ways I had learned to live with what I'd survived. I moved in the first week of November. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. It has an east-facing window that receives morning light. I am still a paramedic. Recertifying under a new name required a series of conversations with the program administrator and the state's EMS licensing board that were among the stranger professional experiences of my career, but they were resolved in the patient, procedural way that bureaucratic problems are resolved when you have the right documentation and the right advocate. I went back to work in January. The work is what it has always been: difficult, important, occasionally extraordinary, and grounding in the specific way that labor which matters is always grounding. I show up for strangers in their worst moments. I apply skill to need. I do the next thing and then the next thing. And at the end of a shift, I go home and I sleep, and in the morning I wake up and I go back. There is nothing complicated about it, and that is precisely what I love about it. Dr. Felicia Osi sees me remotely now. We speak on video call on Wednesday evenings, which is my day off. She asks careful questions. I answer them honestly, or as honestly as I am able, which is more honest than I was 3 years ago and will be more honest still in 3 more years. That has been the consistent direction of things. She told me about a year after the arrests that the specific type of betrayal I had experienced, the kind that lives inside the family, that uses the structure of love against you, takes longer to metabolize than other types of damage. Not because it is necessarily more painful, though it is very painful, but because it does not just injure you, it revises you. It reaches back through your entire history and alters the meaning of things you thought you understood. Every memory of your mother's hand on your forehead when you were sick becomes a document with an asterisk. Every Christmas morning, every birthday, every moment that seemed to prove you were loved, all of it gets renegotiated with what you now know. The mother who read you to sleep and the mother who said yes in that room exist simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other. This is not a process that completes. It is a process you live alongside. She is right about this. Brianne sent me a card. She had been given my address by a channel I still don't fully understand, and the card arrived 3 months after I'd left Vermont. It said, "I knew from day one you were a fighter. I hope you're putting all that fighting towards something good now." It is on my refrigerator and has been there ever since. Agent Voss calls twice a year, around the accident anniversary and in the spring. The calls are brief. She asks how I'm doing. I ask about the proceedings. We are both people who deal in facts rather than processing, and the calls are comfortable in the specific way that exchanges between 2 people who have shared something significant and don't need to perform it are comfortable. Nana Ruth died in February, 4 months after the arrests. She was 81. She had been told about what the family had done, inadvertently, through a conversation she overheard, in the quiet, devastating way that truth arrives when you're no longer able to be shielded from it. She called my new number 3 days before she died. We talked for an hour. She said she was sorry. I said it wasn't hers to carry. She said she knew, but she was sorry anyway. We talked about Grafton, about the cottage, about the summer I was 9, and we picked blueberries every morning and made pancakes, and nothing in the world was complicated for 3 weeks. She said, "You're going to be all right." I said I knew. She died on a Tuesday in February. I found out when I got home from a shift, and I sat in my apartment for a long time, and I cried the way I hadn't cried through any of the rest of it. Not for the trial, not for the arrests, not for the hour in the body bag, or the 5 minutes after the ventilator came out. I cried for Ruth. I cried for the only person in that family who had looked at me with consistent love and had never given me a reason to question whether it was real. And I cried for the family that had never existed except in the form of her. Then I got up. I made tea. I went to bed. I have spent a long time thinking about about what this story is. Not what happened, I know what happened, but what it means, what it builds toward, what the truth of it is that justifies the telling. Here is what I believe. I believe that the reason I survived is not just that I stayed still and listened. I have thought about that a great deal, and I think the staying still and listening was only the last step in a long process. The reason I survived is that I had never fully stopped watching. Even during the years when I was doing everything right, the therapy, the distance, the limited contact, the carefully managed boundaries, I had never stopped keeping the record. Every Christmas conversation, every browser window left open, every Google alert, every phone number I changed, every detail I filed away, all of it was part of the same continuous act of attention. I was paying attention because something in me had understood at a very early age that in the specific family I had been born into, attention was survival. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming here. I am not claiming that trauma makes you stronger. I do not believe that. I believe trauma makes you damaged, and that what you do with the damage is a choice you make over and over again, in 1,000 small ordinary moments, usually without knowing that you're making it. I believe I made that choice, imperfectly and inconsistently, enough times that when the worst moment came, I was capable of the specific thing that the worst moment required. I also believe, and this is harder to say, that I was lucky. I am a paramedic who understands ventilator withdrawal. I was in a hospital where a doctor was paying close enough attention to notice that my heart rate spiked at the sound of specific voices. I had a patient advocate who knew about an FBI agent who had been building a file for 2 years. The alignment of these facts was not inevitable. It was particular. It was specific. Many people in situations much less extreme than mine do not have Sandra Vale and Dr. Reeves and Diane Voss. Many people have no one. I think about this often, and I don't have a way to resolve it into anything satisfying. Here is what I know about my mother. She carried me for 9 months. She named me after her grandmother. She taught me to read. She sat with me when I had chicken pox. She attended my paramedic certification ceremony, and she cried, genuinely, in a way I believe was real. She also sat 3 feet from my hospital bed and said yes. Both of these things are true. They do not resolve each other. They coexist in the same person, in the same history, in the same body of evidence that makes up my understanding of my own life. I will not pretend that the coexistence is comfortable. It is not. But I have stopped requiring it to be resolved before I can continue. Here is what I know about Elliot. He was smart enough to build a system with multiple interlocking components designed to profit from my death, and not smart enough to understand that systems built on concealment require the continued cooperation of the people being concealed from. He prepared everything 8 months in advance. He filed the insurance claim before I was dead. He had the BMW and the Burlington apartment and the seat on the bank board. He believed consistently and completely that he was the smartest person in every room. He was not. He was in rooms where I was present and appeared to be absent. He had spent so many years deciding what I was, careless, dramatic, insufficient, a problem to be managed, that he had stopped seeing me as a person who might be watching. That is the failure that compounds and eventually becomes catastrophic. Deciding someone is less than you and stopping to look at them carefully after that. He is 61 when he's eligible for parole. He will have had 33 years to think about what he decided I was. I am, as of this writing, 28 years old. I live in a city I won't name. I have a 3rd-floor apartment with morning light. I have a job I'm good at. I have Brienne's card on my refrigerator. I have Wednesday evenings with Felicia and twice yearly calls with Voss, and the particular piece that comes with living in a place where no one has a Google alert for your name. I thought about Peanut, the brown mutt from the Hardin shelter who had been there too long. I called the shelter 6 months after I relocated and asked about him. He had been adopted in December, the week before Christmas, by a family in Barrow with 2 children and a house with a yard. The woman I spoke with at the shelter said he was doing very well. She said he seemed happy. I'm glad about that. I'm genuinely glad. I pretended to be unconscious in that hospital bed because I needed to know the truth about the people who were supposed to love me. I needed to hear it from their own mouths, without the performance they maintained when they thought I was watching. I had spent 25 years in that family carrying partial truths and hoping the rest would be better than I feared. What I got, over 4 days in that room, was the complete transmission, the full, unvarnished version of what I was worth to them. And what I found, on the other side of that transmission, was not what I expected. What I found was the world. Not a beautiful world, or a safe world, or a world where terrible things don't happen, because they do, and they will. But a world that contained Brienne and Dr. Reeves and Sandra Vale and Agent Voss and Nana Ruth and Derek, who told you exactly what you'd done wrong. And Felicia, who asked careful questions, and a brown mutt who found a family with a yard. A world where some people, when they encounter a person in the worst moment of their life, choose to do the next right thing, not because it's required of them, not because there's a policy that mandates it, but because they looked at the situation and understood what it needed and decided that was reason enough. That is the world. It also contains my family. Both things are true simultaneously. The fluorescent light hums in the ambulance bay the same way it hummed in that hospital room. Low and constant and institutional. I don't hear grief in it anymore. I hear the sound of continuing. I hear the particular music of a world that keeps running, indifferently and steadily, regardless of what any individual is doing or failing to do within it. I am in it, still here, still breathing. That's enough. Still